Welcome, fellow wildlife avengers, to the Conservationists Assemble. My name is Jonny Bloxham, but here I am known as my alter ego, Captain Conservation, your friendly neighbourhood animal advocate. I am a former zookeeper with a passion for conservation education and the global efforts for threatened species and habitats around the world. I'm inviting you to join me as we take the fight to our planet's biggest villain and my arch-nemesis, extinction. Whether you're new to animal advocacy or a veteran in wildlife preservation, this is the podcast for you. Each week, I'll be teaming up with Earth's mightiest wildlife heroes to unify the greatest collaboration of conservationists ever known, where we will be discussing our planet's epic species and what is being done to save them. This is the Conservationists Assemble. Will you join the fight? Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning in to this week's volume of the Conservationists Assemble. How have you all been? What experiences with nature or thoughts about wildlife have you had this week? Maybe you visited a zoo or heard some wildlife news that sparked an emotion and got you thinking. If this is you and you want to share, you can join the conversation by email or message on Instagram. This week I finally finished wrapping Christmas presents and I look forward to watching my family open them, spending some much appreciated time with them, and of course enjoying lots of good food too. It's very fitting that today's guest is Director of Conservation at the Wildwood Trust in the UK, an organisation focused on the preservation of native UK species, considering that there is a heavy native wildlife theme from my Christmas tree this year, which was on display in the background during our conversation, topped with a rather lovely gold and glittery stag head ornament, which Laura very much appreciated. However, despite working at an organisation focused on native species, Laura's expertise transcends far beyond the nature on our doorstep. Today's episode is about a species of bird from the other side of the world that, prior to 1988, was only known by 5 specimens housed in museums in China until suddenly individuals started appearing in the international bird trade. Joining me now is Laura Gardner to provide a voice for the blue-crowned laughingthrush and the conservation actions focused on their survival. Laura, thank you for joining us on the Conservationists Assemble today. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure, and we're here to discuss a species that I would imagine not many people have heard about, but certainly need the spotlight. But before we get into that, could you just explain to our listeners who you are, where you work, and what your role is, please?
Absolutely. So I'm Laura Gardner and I'm the Director of Conservation at the Wildwood Trust. So we're a native species conservation charity with 2 wildlife parks, one in Kent and one in Devon. I also wear a second hat where I am the studbook coordinator for the blue-crowned laughingthrush, which we are going to be discussing today.
We absolutely are, and far from a native species, but nonetheless a very important one. So on that note, could you just explain to us all about the blue-crowned laughingthrush, what they are, where they're found, what do we know about them?
Absolutely. So the blue-crowned laughingthrush was kind of unknown to certainly sort of the European and North American world until 2000, when it was rediscovered in the wild in China. It's a small, highly social, but critically endangered songbird. So it's quite a small passerine. It's a member of the laughingthrush family. And it remains in a small pocket of feng shui woodland habitat in eastern China, Jiangxi province. We know there are a number of breeding sites within a fairly small range, but we still don't fully understand where the bird overwinters. So it's very vulnerable to urbanization and development.
Yeah, definitely. And that's an interesting point then, I suppose, because not knowing where they overwinter means that you can't necessarily argue against developments in that sense, because you don't know whether there's kind of ground to stand on metaphorically for why they shouldn't develop there.
Absolutely. And we have worked very closely with the forestry bureaus in those areas who have actually protected the breeding sites. So when the birds return to the breeding sites early in the summer, whilst they're there, their activities are protected. But obviously, once they disperse at the end of the breeding season, July, August, we think they probably don't travel too far.
Hmm.
Looking at the morphology of the species, they're kind of, quite a small, round-winged species. So it indicates they probably just disperse into foothills rather than travel any great distance. But obviously, once in the sort of the scrubby habitat of the foothills, they probably congregate in large flocks but move silently through that habitat. So it's very difficult to protect any one particular location.
Certainly, I can imagine it must be difficult, and I imagine that we'll get onto the conservation actions in a bit more detail. But I can imagine these are all conversations that have been had as to ways that we can. So it must be quite exciting at the prospect of trialing methods to try and track where they go. But yeah, I'm sure we'll get onto that in a bit more detail
Mhm.
very shortly. So in terms of them, only obviously being known to us in the Western world very recently, and obviously only rediscovered very recently too. How did that rediscovery happen, and how did we as ex situ conservationists come
Mm.
about housing and having studbook programs for this species?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. So the species first appeared in trade in North America and Europe, and also in Hong Kong, in the late 1980s. And um, they came in large exports of songbird species, and very little was known about them, the wild situation. And at that point, the German conservation organization ZGAP undertook some research to try and better understand the situation of the birds in the wild. And back in 2000, the species was rediscovered, but just in a very tiny fragmented population with a number of breeding sites in a fairly sort of small 8 kilometer range in eastern China. Um, so that founding population that came via trade into Western Europe formed the basis of an insurance population managed by zoological collections. And it's that founding population which is now equal in number to the wild population, and so is critically important for the long-term survival of the species. I think I have been very lucky to be able to visit the remnant wild population and work with people on the ground, protecting the bird's habitat and trying to better understand the ecology. And I think it's very humbling when you're working with species ex situ
Hmm.
to then go and work with the people, in the country of origin, in its natural habitat. But I think it was a revelation to me because what became very clear was that they were learning from my knowledge and understanding of the species because we were able to work with them in much closer proximity. So we knew far more from a captive situation
Hmm.
about the species behavior, social biology, breeding biology, and just general ecology. And that could then be transferred, that cross skilling between in situ and ex situ is really, really important. And that collaboration has continued. So, my work with Blue Crowns has been, well, we're now 2024. So it was the end of the sort of, I've been working with species since the late 80s, really. So it's a kind of a life's work, really, and absolutely passionate about the species, but, very, very vulnerable to disappearing in the wild. There have been some success stories in that the species is elevated to full protected species status in China now, which is great. But as you said, at the beginning, we can protect the areas where we know the birds are. but we really need to do further research to investigate more about the sort of the cycle through the seasons of where the birds are, what habitat they're utilising, and how we can then best protect them.
And I suppose now would be an appropriate point to talk about what that research might, or what form that research might come in. Again, from a kind of a naive standpoint, as someone that doesn't know the species that well, but generalizing research from other species, would it be a kind of a tracking situation? Obviously, we couldn't radio collar a bird like you would a mammal, but you can fit tracking things. Are there software that are that small for the species that would be in consideration, or is it another
It
form?
would be, I mean, that's a really good question. And I think, we are looking into technologies and they are ever advancing, which is great. I think the nature of the species um, precludes a certain types of tracking devices. For instance, there's a tracking device that you can use that gives you a lot of data on a very large scale. So if it was a migratory species, you could plot where it is over a long distance. So, there's lots of different species of birds that utilize this and, follows them through their migration pathway. If we've got a very, very small passerine, such as the blue-crowned laughingthrush, and their range is very small, so they might only move between, a few kilometers between the breeding site and the wintering site, you won't get that quality of data to actually understand their movements. So at the moment, we have trialed some tracking devices, but we haven't really gathered the quality data that is really informing our understanding of where the birds are going. So at the moment, it's still a knowledge gap. But we are also working with in-country partners, particularly academic partners, who are keen to continue furthering the understanding of the species and where it goes. And I think that is the main opportunity to better understand this. Having people on the ground, following the birds, and trialing maybe some tracking devices appropriate to the habitat and the range of the bird.
Absolutely, and yeah, I suppose like it's one of those things that it's always going to be trial and error, and it's exciting to see how the successes are going to come because with the dedicated people on the ground, those successes will hopefully come,
Yeah.
and yeah, very
Mm.
exciting to see what form those successes come in. So, in terms of ways that the zoos are contributing, obviously you mentioned that the population is now here, and as not only the stud bookkeeper for the species, you're co-convener of the Global Species Management Plan. How does working with North America, for example, benefit the species within captivity or within human care?
Yeah. Well, I think any conservation breeding program tries to maintain as much genetic diversity of that population for as long as possible. Um, and then if you're working, so you've got a European population, there's in zoos, you've got a North American zoo population, and there are also a couple of zoological collections in Asia. So bringing all of that data together, you're not just looking at these regional populations, but you're managing a meta population. And that's where you might have representation of certain genetic lineages that are maybe overrepresented in one region, but unrepresented in another. And then where you can be far more impactful in your management of the meta population by transferring and making breeding recommendations and transfer recommendations outside of each region. And that maximizes the founder representation across the whole population.
And that is, I suppose, on paper, when you think about zoos and modern zoos and what they're doing for species in conservation, genetics and breeding is typically the thing that gets the most representation or that everyone is mostly aware of. But you mentioned, like you said, when you went out to China to collaborate with the people in country, that you were able to transfer knowledge about reproductive biology and social ecology.
Hmm.
And so, what specifically have we learned about those, maybe those aspects of the blue-crowned laughing thrush within zoos that we've been able to transfer to the in situ population?
Yeah, it is what we have seen in the wild, which is also mirrored in the captive zoo situation, is that they are highly social. Um, but what we need to factor in when we're managing a species within a controlled environment, such as a zoological collection, is that there'll be reasons why a species behaves in the way it does. For instance, in the wild, there is this almost like a critical mass. So if you have a breeding population of between 30 and 40 individuals or more, that population can withstand or respond effectively to predation risk. So in China, the main predators and risks to the species at the breeding sites are squirrels who will steal eggs, raid nests, corvids who will take nests or nestlings, eggs and nestlings, and also snakes. And we have seen, we've videoed, we've set up nest cameras, we've seen snakes accessing the nest. The sitting bird, sits till the last minute, then abandons the nest, and the eggs and any chicks are taken. So those are very, very sort of significant threats to a wild population. However, things like squirrels and corvids, less so with snakes. But what we have seen is there is an alarm call when you've got a large colony of birds. If any of those nests are threatened, there's an alarm call, and all of the birds flock together and mob the predator, driving it away, and then hopefully safeguarding those nests and chicks inside. If you get to a small population size, they behave in the same way. But if you've only got 4 birds trying to drive off a flock of jays or a couple of magpies, then that's going to be less successful. So that is a breeding and survival strategy that a very small passerine has adopted to ensure breeding survival and success in the wild. However, when you translate that to a captive situation where we can control the predators, essentially, hopefully remove the predation risk because of the way in which we keep the birds. However, when you keep them in a large flock together, you get lots of social behaviors, like you'll get extramarital interbreeding, if you like. So you'll have pairs, and the female might go and mate with another male, or she might lay an egg in another pair's nest, or there might be squabbles over nest material, which undermines the integrity of the nest. So sometimes it's more effective to just keep in a zoological collection 1 or 2 pairs together, because they then focused on their nesting and they're completely dedicated to rearing of their chicks. You don't have to have the flock mentality, because that is really a strategy to mitigate the threats of predation, which doesn't really apply in a captive setting. But thinking through multiple generations, obviously you need to be thinking that, yes, you're maintaining this genetically diverse insurance population. Should there be a point at which you want to draw from that population to do reintroductions, assuming there's suitable habitat into which to put birds back? But you need to also consider, are you in some way unwittingly changing the behavior of that species? Just because it's the best way to manage them in a captive situation, are you then making sure you're not sort of changing any of those behavioral traits, which is a survival strategy for the wild? So it's interesting and complicated, and each informs the other. And I think at the moment we are managing the zoo population as an insurance population. If in 5 years' time we think the role of that zoo population is for species reintroduction, then we're going to have to critically review what are our management techniques? We need to make sure that we are breeding birds which are behaviourally and genetically appropriate for reintroduction back into the wild. So we need to be thinking about all of those elements from a captive and wild population.
And what kind of people then would be involved in trialing, or not necessarily trialing, but thinking about looking forward those kind of routine changes or those management changes that would perhaps be trialed in such a situation should it come to that?
Well, I think this would come under the auspices of the stud book and probably the Global Species Management Plan, where it's more of a holistic approach. Obviously, there'll be the regional populations, but they sort of all of those feed into that sort of global data set and the population analysis. We aren't there yet, unfortunately. We're not looking at reintroducing blue crowns back into the wild. But what we have learnt is in terms of breeding success, do we have more breeding success when we're keeping birds as a colony, or do we have more breeding success if we're trying to keep the birds in pairs? And then we can look at the genetic lineages that are most important and selecting pairs and prioritizing those pairs for breeding rather than keeping them as a flock. And some of the techniques that we have trialed as a stud book, that co-conveners of the GSMP and regional stud book holders, has been to try and bring together those two things. So a way in which we have done that is by maintaining a flock of birds, and all of the males are brothers, and then all of the females are sisters, but from obviously different parents. So the females are related and the males are related, but the males and females are unrelated. So that gives you a sort of it doesn't really matter which individuals pair up. It doesn't matter if there's any egg dumping between pairs, because genetically, all of the chicks reared genetically will be the same because they come from the same lineages, if you like. So, but we don't always have the luxury of having enough chicks from enough, sort of pairs to put that setup together. But that's something that we've trialed, and it seems to be very successful because you're maintaining the natural behavior of flocking. You can still tightly control the genetics, but that's not always an option available depending on how many birds we've bred successfully the year before.
It's interesting though. So they're almost like a control group to see
Yeah,
if that behaviour would be possible to replicate within under human care.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And we have witnessed a lot of there's this very strong social hierarchy as well within the species. And I think again that is something that is possibly a survival strategy in the wild. So not all birds of breeding age will pair up and breed. Quite often youngsters from a pair, although they're old enough to go and breed themselves, they remain in a family unit and they become helpers at the nest. So you'll get you have a family of birds that were bred in 2023, for instance, rather than go off, disperse, make their own pairings and nest themselves, they retain this family grouping. And so when their parents effectively have the next set of eggs at the following year, they are helpers. So they're ensuring the next generation of their own lineage, if you like. And that will also then help mitigate any predation because it's increasing. They're investing everything in the protection of their family's nest, if you like.
So it really is crucial then, not only obviously just to keep population numbers up in the wild, but to really make sure these populations don't become fragmented.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think, it's the numbers within each breeding population, which is important. It's also um, making sure that what we think we know is that all of the birds congregate over winter. So that only happens if, they're relatively close. And what we have found, they'll quite often use natural linear features such as rivers, and the breeding flocks will be, sort of within a couple of kilometers along a stretch of river, where there's suitable habitat. They particularly like areas of woodland, protected tall trees, sort of feng shui woodland, which often surrounds rural villages, and they're protected. So you've not only got the fact that there's not many tall trees
Mm.
in rural areas because of urbanization, etc. So that's where you tend to see the remnant populations hanging on, and sort of those cultural traditions of um, uh, gardens where people grow their own fruit and vegetables. The birds will also utilize a lot of that, like the dry grasses they'll use for nesting material. Um, the established trees, they will feed on the insects in the bark, particularly when they've got chicks in the nest. And also, sort of the allotment type gardens, they will also eat the fruits that the people are growing as well. So, and you've got the watercourse there. So those tend to be the main features that will indicate it's a suitable nesting area. But there's in any situation we know globally, there's so many pressures on important habitats and
Mm.
the habitats themselves are dynamic and ever changing. And so doing everything we can, not only just to work with in-country partners to protect those remnant habitats, to ensure there's connectivity between summer breeding sites and wintering locations, but also to try and protect them from further development, and maintaining, while all of this is going on, your ex situ zoological population, which is your fallback
Yes.
situation. But it's also a really good way of raising awareness. You've got all of that public engagement, you've got education, and so there's lots of roles for the ex situ population as well as insurance.
Yeah, and I suppose certainly in recent years, not necessarily pinpointed on the blue crown laughing thrush specifically, but there's been the Yaza Silent Forest campaign, which,
Mhm.
as someone more clued up in this field than I, would you say that has had a profound positive effect on this species, despite that it was, targeting a range of different species throughout Southeast Asia?
I think the EASA songbird program, Asian songbird program, has been hugely successful. It really has shone a spotlight on all of the threats, songbird trade, um, the driving factors affecting the illegal trade in all sorts of species, and raising funds which are then dedicated, having in-country breeding programs and facilities available, raising awareness, and I think it's hugely valuable. In the blue-crowned laughing thrush hasn't really been much of a focal species. It is part of the Asian songbird group, but there've been other species that have been sort of more of a direct target, some of the like the barley starling and the Javan green magpie and other species, which there's so many species at risk out there. But shining a spotlight in this way has been very, very effective, and allowing large and small collections, zoological collections, to play a role, where there's a species that is an ambassador in our zoos for the threatened species in the wild.
And in terms of public perception in their range, well, in China, for example, then you mentioned how they're quite an adaptive species in the sense that they will utilize nesting material and fruits from people's gardens. Apart from them being in the trade, would they? What's the perception to that change? Are they seen as pests, or do people maybe enjoy seeing them in their gardens? And that's obviously coming from a Western perspective, where I know my parents, for example, enjoy watching the birds in their garden. Is it a similar attitude to the blue-crowned laughing thrush, for example?
Um, that's a really good question, and I have seen different responses in different locations. Um, for instance, there's a growing popularity for photography in China. Um, and so there's a huge appetite to take photographs, the best photograph of a critically endangered species, which in a way you could say it's shining the spotlight, it's raising awareness of the species,
Hmm.
but it's also attracting a kind of there's a negative element to that where you're increasing the visitation and the footfall and risking disturbance to the species which are very vulnerable. And there has been a study in China looking at disturbance of photographers to the blue-crowned laughingthrush. And this was some research undertaken by students from Jiangxi Agricultural University. And they actually found that the blue-crowned laughingthrush changed in response to this direct pressure, changed the altitude at which they built their nests in trees because of this disturbance. And this was a direct result of interest by photographers visiting these sites en masse, despite the fact that there is a lot of the breeding sites are protected and there's restricted access, but it was still that extra visitation that wasn't there before. We also have some very interesting anecdotal stories about um, people renting out their rooms to photographers because if they rent out the bedroom, somebody can go into their bedroom, look out the window, and actually take some fantastic pictures of a blue-crowned laughingthrush nest. So there's an element of entrepreneurism there.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's tricky because you want people to be aware. You want to drive a sense of pride.
Mm.
However, it's a very difficult line to tread. You don't want to reach a tipping point and then it becomes drawing too much attention, which could then be negative. Um, I
Yeah.
think when I visited a couple of the sites, people got to know us. They knew the species that we were looking at. And when we would arrive at the sort of the small village, all of the children would come out, say, they're over there, and they'd take us to them, which was lovely. But equally, we heard some stories that, one of the nests was in a local playground and one of the nests had been destroyed by children just throwing stones. And just because they didn't, they're just being children.
Yeah.
But when you've got a critically endangered species, it's just like, it's heartbreaking. But
Yeah.
I think that there's no different to situation that we have in the UK, right? So you get some
Absolutely.
people who love wildlife and cherish it, and other people that are just like, yeah, well, it's a bird, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
um,
Very fine balance. But yeah, I suppose focusing on that positive reaction and trying to keep it as such that it's the best for the birds first, and but also
hmm,
then beneficial for
yeah,
those who get to enjoy them
yeah.
second. And yeah, having
There are
that support.
certainly things that we have done with our partners in country which have had a very positive impact. And it's things like encouraging going into schools and not talking about individual species, but maybe just take a guidebook to the birds of China, and introduce them to, bird watching.
Mm.
Here are some binoculars. What birds can you go and see? So to sense, just to encourage an interest in the natural world. And those children that become interested, they're then more informed, which drives this sort of natural curiosity, and they will be tomorrow's conservationists.
Hmm.
So, it doesn't have to be too targeted, but I think just to encourage a respect for wildlife and the natural world is a very positive step for any species.
And so then talking about the public in the UK, for example, what can they do and how can they get involved and keep up to date with the conservation effort for the blue-crowned laughingthrush or just Asian songbirds in general, even if they aren't directly involved with them?
Well, I think the main conduit really is through zoological collections. So, it's interesting that the role of zoos has kind of really changed over the past sort of, 40, 50 years. So, historically, zoos were menageries for people to go and be entertained. And but now, you can get on a plane, you can turn on your television, and you can explore every element, every area of the natural world from your sofa. So, the role of zoos is more about um, conservation messages, raising awareness, um, being able to fill knowledge gaps by undertaking research. Most zoos these days will have academic partners, linking those to in-country partners for the species in the species range. It's really, really beneficial. And so just sort of telling the story, raising awareness of the species that are at risk, whether it's in China or our own species at home.
Hmm.
There's so many conservation messages to tell, but it's driving that interest in the natural world as a starting point, and then finding out more. And then through your zoo, you can find out about the Asian songbird trade. You can find out about the Bali starling, the Javan green magpie, the blue-crowned laughingthrush, and all of the species that are vulnerable to extinction because of man-modified behaviors, man-modified landscapes, and our behaviors and how we impact on the natural world. And people can play a really vital role in that by visiting your zoo. You're actually giving money. Most zoos in the UK, for instance, we don't get any public funding other than visitors through the gate.
Hmm.
And some zoos in Europe, they get a percentage from the town, if you like. It's like a tax. I don't know quite how it works in the States, but I think there's a lot of pressure on zoos today just to stay open. But the
Hmm.
vital work that zoos do by visiting your zoo, getting engaged, it's still a good day out. We still want people to have a great time. Um, but there's a very important message to take away. Um, and that's about valuing the wildlife that we have and the habitats that upon which they depend.
Absolutely, and I think you've kind of rounded up all of the different elements of conservation for this species and where it's going. So we're going to switch track now, Laura, and we're going to look into your journey into your professional background and to your current position. So yeah, please tell us how you first got involved or when you knew you was going to get involved in conservation.
Wow, gosh, that's going back a long time. So I I'm lucky enough to have been brought up on Jersey, so my family are from Jersey, um, and I just always been mad about animals, wanting to work with animals in some capacity. And so when I was 10 years old, I decided I wanted to go and do voluntary work at Jersey Zoo. So my summer holidays and weekends, I'd get on the bus and travel to the zoo, and they were very accommodating and let me come and um, effectively try and help, um, which was amazing. And I actually met Gerald Durrell and
Amazing.
shook his hand, and I don't think I washed my hand for a week. It's this god of conservation. And for me, that was such a turning point because, I don't know whether these days you'd even be allowed at that age to go into a zoo and do voluntary work, but it was life changing for me, and just like this is what I want to do. Um, and then yeah, I think it was very hard going through school because when I was trying to make sort of decisions about A levels and higher education, it was for women, it was quite difficult to go down the science route. So I was kind of pushed into the arts, which was fine, but it took me away from going into the zoological element, area in terms of scientific background. So literally, I just, when I finished uni, I just banged on doors and said, "Look, give me a job," and yeah, just worked my way up as a sort of junior keeper, then became sort of, senior keeper, then curator, and it was a small bird collection for a long time, which was amazing. That's where I first got involved with the Blue-crowned Laughingthrush project. And then I moved to ZSL. So I was at
Hmm.
ZSL for 6 years, which was amazing to be working for such a globally recognized conservation organization. And then I moved to Wildwood Trust here in Kent, where I'm based, um, and using all of my skills and adapting them to the conservation of native species. And it was a steep learning curve for me because I'd always come very much from a bird background.
Hmm.
Um, but there was such an amazing skill set here within Wildwood. So we're doing so many amazing conservation breeding, research, and species reintroduction projects at the moment. Talking about wildcats, red-billed chaff, not blue-crowned laughingthrush, that's not a native species. Um, Pine martins, hazel dormice, water voles, and you just think there's so many conservation charities working globally, but actually, if we look in our own backyard, there's so much work that needs to be done. And it's interesting because most children will know about the plight of tigers and
Hmm.
rhinos, and and you mentioned water voles and dormice, and people like, what does that look like? So we've not been very good at raising awareness about our own threatened species here in the UK, but that is changing. There's a real momentum behind native species conservation at the moment, which is great, and I'm very lucky to be working at Wildwood, which is a leading native species conservation charity.
So yeah, sounds like a fantastic journey. I mean, what a zoo to first have your experiences with like say none other than the foundation that Gerald Durrell himself laid down. And you mentioned obviously the time at the small bird collection, and that was where your first experience with the blue-crowned laughing thrush was. So talk us through that first experience. What drove you to really be like, I'm going to dedicate 40 plus years to this species.
It was kind of accidental, to be honest. Yeah, so I worked at the Leeds Castle Aviary, which was a small bird garden within the sort of the Leeds Castle estate, very large tourist attraction. And one of its last private owner, Lady Bailey, had a real passion for birds. So when Lady Bailey passed away, a memorial aviary was set up in memory of her. And so a new aviary was built, with a lot of the species that Lady Bailey had worked with, but we also looked at, what other species could we be working with? And one of the species that we got pretty much by accident, and again, this is where I was saying in the late 80s, these birds were coming imported from Asia, coming through trade. And that at the time was a source of a lot of stock for
Mm.
zoological collections. And so we saw this species, uh, and we were like, what is this bird? This is amazing. It's stunningly beautiful. And we couldn't find anything about it. There was very little literature about it. We couldn't find out what its status was in the wild. And this was back in 1987. Um, and so we acquired a group of 5 birds for bird garden at Leeds Castle, and started working with them. Um, and I just think, that sort of due diligence is you want to find out as much as possible about any of the species you're working with. Um, and just there was so little information. Even just trying to get a, a definite identification of the species was tricky. Um, And so I reached out to colleagues in China, and that's where they were saying, actually, this German conservation charity has just funded a search for this species in the wild because we know it's coming through trade, and it has this small population has been rediscovered. And so the person leading the field work then said, wow, you've been working with a species in a captive situation. Would you like to come and visit China? And we can sort of kind of share notes, if you
Mhm.
like. And it took 2 years of getting the funds to go. But I went out and that's when it all started. And then obviously there were other, there were, I can't remember exactly how many birds had come through trade, but there were quite a lot of individual blue-crowned laughing thrushes that had appeared at other collections as well. And it made sense that, we were all working together, understanding, um, how to manage the birds most productively, how to record information, how to move birds to manage effectively a population. So it was the first development of the breeding program, if you like, and then working with the in-country partners. And it's just taken off from there. It started off very much as I don't know if anybody remembers, but the JSMP programs, which were the forerunners of the breeding programs. Um, and then it was a European, an ESB stud book, and then it went to an endangered species stud book, and then it's an international stud book, and now we've got the global species management plan. Um, so yeah, it kind of has evolved, and obviously progressed with my own career development in terms of moving from a trainee keeper all the way up to curator of birds at that particular collection.
Yeah, what I suppose that yeah, like I say, a surprising little species that you just happen to stumble across, and that's quite often how it does happen for a lot of people, isn't it? It's just you had no necessary you didn't necessarily have any ambition of working with those species, but
No, I
you just
didn't,
fell
but
into it
it's
and
yeah. And I think if you when you see the blue-crowned laughing thrush, there's such a beautiful bird, stunningly beautiful bird with this yellow belly and the blue nape and the black band across the eye. Um, and they're so social, and they've got this, obviously, as the name suggests, the laughing thrush, they've got this really melodic call. So you can't, and they're always active. They're always doing things, they like to bathe. They're always preening each other. It's lots of um, social um, behaviors and interactions. It's almost impossible not to fall in love with them. Um, and yeah, and I think, the more you know about the species, then that fuels more knowledge and passion about them. And I think that's, if you look back at the conservation successes for any species, you always see it needs a species champion,
mhm.
whether that's a stud book coordinator or just somebody absolutely passionate about that species, banging the drum, saying, "Hey, what about this guy?" And I think, whether that's I maybe had a part to play in that, which is great, but there've been other people along the way as well. And I think that's true of all species conservation stories.
Absolutely, and speaking about or kind of about those people along the way that maybe share a similar passion for this species, or just that you've worked alongside with in your career, do you have any mentors or anyone that's influenced? Obviously, aside from meeting Gerald Durrell as a young girl, are there any other mentors or key figures in your career that have given you kind of advice or motivation to keep going?
I think there've been key people that have given me advice and inspired me to keep going. There's also people that you kind of think, oh, you know, the opposite, but you've got to rise above it. And I think conservationists are naturally optimists. You've got to
Hmm.
bounce back and keep going. Um, but definitely, as you say, Gerald Durrell was such an inspiration. And it's actually quite sad now when you mention his name to some of the younger people that come to the parks and they like, who? I
Mm.
say, oh my God, I think the other name to mention is Carl Jones. Carl is such a modest, unassuming man, and he has been at the forefront of the conservation success, particularly for birds, for a long time, and he has inspired me. Proud to say he's now a friend and a colleague. And yeah, I think he's always somebody that if you're kind of on the you think, oh, I've had a really hard day. I'm really struggling with this. It's the sort of person that you can have a phone call with, and you just think, yeah, yeah, I'm back on that horse now, and I'm absolutely committed. I'm going to keep going.
Fantastic. Yeah, it's certainly a very important role in as well as you say, like you say, with a lot of young keepers and young conservationists coming through the doors because of how, for lack of a better word, popular this industry is in terms of those wanting to work with it. Being able to keep people motivated certainly is crucial. So, what advice then now would you perhaps, as someone in that role where you've got young conservationists working alongside you, would you give to someone looking to pursue a career in conservation?
Ooh, what advice and guidance I would give? Well, actually, I think it's probably a very exciting time to be working in conservation. However, I think there's never been so much pressure to have conservation success. We're facing climate change, biodiversity crises. It's now or never, for sure. Um, there is a lot of frustration in terms of we're slow to catch up from a policy and legislation point of view. So in some aspects, there's not the framework to deliver the things we need to be delivering. Um, but I think that makes the role even more significant to be the species champion, to bang on those closed doors and make sure that we are able to deliver what's needed to be delivered. The time frame is getting smaller. We can't really afford to keep waiting to
Mm.
understand everything before we do anything. We have to learn by doing. It's got to be evidence-based approach, and science definitely informs the conservation action, but we can learn by doing and working very closely with the academic partners, make sure that we can implement effective and rigorous conservation action.
Yeah, very wise. I suppose it highlights that while obviously everyone knows it's a crucial industry, that it's not a perfect industry, but as long as you're willing to keep at it and acknowledge that there will be downs when the
Yeah,
ups do happen, nothing nothing
yeah,
tops that.
no. I think anybody going into conservation, um, you've got to be resilient,
Hmm.
you've got to be adaptable, hugely stubborn, dogged determination is definitely an asset. Um, but yeah, just don't lose sight of your vision. That's what I would say.
So then, reflecting on the industry as we should, as every industry should, in order to progress. And I think I personally am quite an advocate of being constructively critical of zoos. I love zoos. I'm passionate of zoos. This is where I cut my teeth. But if you could improve just one thing about this industry, what do you think it would be?
Wow, gosh. And that's tricky because there are very good zoos. And I think the British and Irish Association of Zoos and Aquaria um, is a fantastic umbrella organisation that sets the standard, really. And zoo, most zoos in the UK are members.
Mhm.
So we have a very high standard of welfare and management within zoos in UK. In Europe, there's a broader range, but you have the European Association of Zoos and Aquaria. And again, membership of those, it kind of gives you a sort of uh, a trust that that organization is well managed. It fulfills its conservation objectives. But I also think um, there are things that we could do better. I think we are very notoriously bad about talking about our success stories.
Mhm.
Um, because we're so busy doing what we're doing, sometimes we don't have time to stop and start shouting about the amazing work that zoos do. Um, and that is kind of self-damaging, really, as
Hmm.
well, or limiting, because having more public awareness and appreciation of the invaluable work undertaken by zoos for conservation benefit um, doesn't help when we're trying to find funds to continue that absolutely invaluable work. Um, so, we shoot ourselves in the foot a little bit, in that respect. But I think it's, as I said earlier, the role of zoos has changed. We play a vital role in species conservation. It's very broad, it's very dynamic, but it's misunderstood, and that's probably our fault.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, absolutely. If zoos don't shout about the work that zoos are doing, no one else is gonna
Yeah,
do it for them, kind of
yeah,
thing. And I think, yeah, like you said, we are starting to see that shift in more ex situ organisations taking ownership of the word zoo now because
mm,
of that negative stereotype that it's been associated with for a long, long time, and to some extent is still associated with it. But like you say, we are
yeah,
starting to see that shift in perceptions because
yeah,
of that changing role.
yeah.
So you've been very fortunate to have gone out to China, for example, and see wild blue-crowned laughing thrush, and obviously with your focus on native species at the moment, are there any dream species that you'd love to work with or to see in the wild?
Oh, I'd love to go whale watching.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think sort of marine mammals and cetaceans is a passion of mine, but something I've never really had the time to find out more about. But something I would love to do. I think coming from an island, um, I love the sea. I like to be by the sea. I love being on boats. So maybe in another life I could have been a marine biologist, but who knows?
Well, certainly, yeah, a fantastic experience that would be,
Mm.
nonetheless. So we can certainly send out positive affirmations that hopefully one day it'll be something that you achieve. And similar to that, then, are there any places that you would love to visit?
Oh, loads. Gosh, yes. Going to China was amazing. That was lovely. I have been lucky to visit quite a few countries. I've been to Brazil, which was amazing. I've worked with toucans a lot, and seeing toucans in the wild was just stunning. That was a kind of up there with one of my lifetime achievements, I
Amazing.
guess. Um, uh, it's very difficult to put it down to one place. I'd
Hmm.
love to go to Vietnam, Indonesia. I mean, I was lucky enough to take my family on holiday to Bali. Um, and actually, one of the most amazing experiences I ever had was swimming or snorkeling with manta rays, and
Yeah.
it's just one of those things that, we are a world that lives, we are so detached
Hmm.
from the natural world. Having an encounter like that, which is so almost primal.
Hmm.
It is very humbling, um, and will stay with me forever. And it's something that I find very hard to talk about because it was such an amazing experience.
Now, obviously, we've talked about the Asian Songbird campaign, and you've got that appreciation for the vocalizations of the blue-crowned laughing thrush. Would you say that that's your favorite sound made by an animal, or is there another sound that animals make? Because there's such a vast range of noises made by an animal. Is there a sound that really resonates with you?
Ah, yeah, sure. And I'm sure there's only a tiny percentage of all of the sounds and vocalizations and calls that I've actually ever heard. But I think one that comes to mind and took my breath away at the time was listening to the the clacking and guttural vocalizations of the shoebill, and standing very close to the shoebill, which was in a zoo. And it was I don't know, arm's length away from me, obviously the other side of the barrier.
Hmm.
But it was vocalizing, and it was like something from a dinosaur. and it just the reverberation went straight through me, and that was like wow, incredible.
After a day fighting extinction, how do you relax?
Oh, I find it really hard to switch off. Um, I think sometimes I think, you know what, I just want to work in a supermarket on the checkout. So when I get home, I don't have to think about anything, because I
Hmm.
think when you're so invested and you're so passionate about what you do, you can't really switch off. It's very difficult.
Hmm.
Um, so I kind of think I've got dogs. I love my dogs,
Hmm.
and going out with my dogs for a dog walk is kind of my time. And I wouldn't say I switch off, um, but that's kind of my indulgent time, really.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's certainly important to make time for that, even if your head is still focused on
Mm.
the work at hand. At least your body is doing something a bit different.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, how can our listeners follow the work for the Blue Crown Laughing Thrush? Where would you direct them so they could stay up to date with the advances?
Now that's a really good question. So obviously, being a critically endangered species, it is on the Handbook of the Birds of the World, which is a resource that is available online. Um, some of it is open access, some of it obviously is paid for access. BirdLife International, their data zone, you can input the blue-crowned laughing thrush. It will take you to their web pages. Um, Most of the zoos that work with the species would also have like a species profile, and what they're doing in terms of the conservation of the species should be available on their websites. Um, so the actual breeding programs and the global species management plan, there'll be information on WASA, so the World Association of Zoological uh, and Aquaria, and also EASA, European Association of Zoos and Aquaria, and the North American equivalent AZA. So there's a certain amount on these zoological websites. Most of it for individual zoos is obviously public facing.
Sure.
The membership, like European zoos, Aquaria, and the North American zoos, it's really for zoos, but an element, certain parts of that will be open access. You don't have to be members to access all of the data.
Fantastic. And do you have any last messages for any fellow wildlife avengers who might be out there?
Just believe in what you're doing. And it sounds really, really um, crass, but you know what? You are making a difference.
Hmm.
You may think, this is just a droplet in the ocean. What on earth can I achieve? Everything you do has an impact, and just keep doing it.
With that last question, Laura, thank you so much for teaming up with me on this volume of the Conservationists Assemble. It has been an absolute pleasure to listen to your incredible knowledge on blue-crowned laughing thrush and your unwavering dedication to ensuring a future for the species. You are a valuable ally in the fight against extinction, and we wish you continued success going forward, both on the native species front with the team at the Wildwood Trust and with the blue-crowned laughing thrush and your colleagues both in situ and ex situ fighting for their survival.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. It's been a complete pleasure.
And of course, a huge shout out to you, my fellow wildlife avengers, for tuning in. If you enjoyed this episode of the podcast and you wish to join the fight, please follow, subscribe and rate the podcast wherever you stream from. Please also follow on social media to stay up to date with the podcast's latest developments, and share with your family, friends and colleagues to help stack the odds in conservation's favour. Don't forget you can join the fight by joining the conversation. Share your thoughts and suggestions on this episode, past episodes or future episodes via email at conservationistassemble@outlook.com or on Instagram at conservationistassemblepod. And if you've happened to see blue-crowned laughing thrush in zoos or in the wild, and you wish to share photos or videos or just your stories that you may have of them, these are also the places for that to happen. I hope you've all had a fantastic 2024. Thank you for coming along with me on this journey. I look forward to providing you all with more fantastic episodes with some awesome animal avengers in 2025. Happy New Year, everyone. This is Captain Conservation signing off. Over and out.